The eerie, almost victorious silence that had settled over Ukraine in the wake of its stunningly successful drone and jet raid on the Engels II and Morozovsk air bases lasted for a mere 36 hours, a brief, hopeful interlude where it seemed that perhaps a decisive blow had been struck, that the Russian bear had been bloodied enough to reconsider its relentless campaign of terror. But this hope was a dangerous illusion. A fleeting moment of calm that was systematically and deliberately shattered at 8 o'clock precisely on the morning of September 16, 2025, not with the familiar, dreaded wail of air raid sirens, but with a new, deeper, more visceral sound that seemed to emanate from the very earth itself, a low-frequency hum that vibrated through concrete walls and rattled windows hundreds of kilometers from the front lines, a sound that was the acoustic signature of a weapons system so feared, so powerful, and so indiscriminate that its use had been considered a geopolitical taboo. A sound that announced to the world that Russia, humiliated and enraged by the audacity of the Ukrainian strikes deep into its territory, had now cast aside all pretenses of conventional warfare and had chosen to unleash its most dreaded and devastating weapons from the depths of the Cold War arsenal, not to achieve a tactical objective, but to methodically and sadistically dismantle the entire Ukrainian national project piece by piece, to erase its cities, its history, and its will to resist from the map through the application of pure, unadulterated, apocalyptic force. This was not merely an escalation, it was the opening of a new and final chapter in the conflict, a chapter written in the language of absolute annihilation, and it began with the deployment of the TOS-1A, Solntsepyak, Sahit, heavy thermobaric rocket systems, moving up in batteries of 12 to the very edge of the contested towns of Avdiivka and Marinka, where their monstrous 220mm rockets, each filled with a volatile thermobaric fuel that upon detonation creates a suffocating vacuum that vaporizes internal organs and collapses lungs, were launched in volleys that saturated the sky with fire, not targeting military positions but the deep, reinforced basements and subway stations where civilians had been sheltering for months, turning these sanctuaries into tombs in a matter of seconds. They use a blatant war crime designed to maximize psychological terror. But the TOS-1A was merely the opening act, the brutal fist to soften the target before the knockout blow, which arrived from the skies in the form of the Kh-47M2 Kinzhal hypersonic ballistic missiles, launched in numbers never before seen from MiG-31K interceptors circling over the Caspian Sea, traveling at speeds exceeding Mach 10. These weapons were not aimed at power grids or command centers this time, but at the very foundations of the Patriot and SAMP/T air defense batteries that formed the last shield over Ukraine's major cities, their kinetic energy alone enough to obliterate the launchers and radar units upon impact. A systematic and costly campaign to blind Ukraine and punch holes in its defensive canopy through which the next, even more terrifying wave could pass. And that next wave was the most feared of all, the reintroduction of the RBK-500 cluster bomb munitions, but these were not the old Soviet-era models. These were newly produced, digitally enhanced and far more deadly, dispensed from Su-34 fighter bombers now flying with impudence over Ukrainian skies as the air defenses were degraded. Each canister releasing hundreds of PTB-1M anti-tank and incendiary submunitions that rained down over vast areas of the countryside, farmland, and even the outskirts of cities like Kherson and Mykolaiv, their purpose not just to destroy armored vehicles but to render entire regions uninhabitable, to poison the soil with unexploded ordnance, and to kill anything that moved in the open, a weapon so horrific that over 100 nations had banned its use. Yet, even this was not the extent of the horror, for Russian strategic forces then unveiled a weapon that had only been rumored to exist in intelligence briefings, the Deadliest electronic warfare system, mounted on two Tu-14R intelligence aircraft, which created a moving bubble of complete electronic silence around itself, a zone where Ukrainian drones fell from the sky like stones, guidance systems fried, where encrypted military communications were reduced to static, and where the GPS signals guiding precious HIMARS and Storm Shadow missiles were utterly scrambled, rendering these technological marvels useless and leaving Ukrainian units blind, deaf, and mute on the battlefield, isolated and vulnerable to the final, grinding advance of Russian ground forces. This advance was now spearheaded by the T-14 Armata main battle tanks, held in reserve for years, now deployed en masse for the first time, their unmanned turrets and advanced armor making them nearly impervious to the dwindling stocks of Ukrainian Javelin and NLAW missiles, and supported by the terrifying BMPT, Terminator, tank support vehicles, whose quartet of cannons and automatic grenade launchers could saturate a city block with suppressing fire, flushing out defenders and clearing a path for the infantry that followed. The combined effect of these deadliest weapons was a level of destruction that dwarfed anything seen before in the conflict. Cities like Chasiv Yar, which had held out for months, were reduced to smoldering rubble in a matter of days under the relentless thermobaric and cluster bomb barrages, their defenders annihilated in their positions. Ukrainian brigades, cut off from command and control by the pervasive electronic warfare, found themselves surrounded and overwhelmed by the advancing Armata columns, and the civilian death toll skyrocketed into the tens of thousands as the laws of war were completely abandoned in favor of a strategy of total eradication. The international response was one of stunned, paralyzed horror, as NATO leaders convened emergency summits but found themselves trapped between the existential need to respond and the terrifying prospect of a direct confrontation with a Russia that had now demonstrated its willingness to use every tool in its arsenal, no matter how barbaric, while Ukraine, bleeding and battered but unbroken, fought on with a desperate courage, using every last drone, every last artillery shell, and every last ounce of will to slow the advance, knowing that the deployment of these weapons was not a sign of Russian strength, but the furious, desperate lashing out of a regime that had been shocked by its own vulnerability and was now trying to win through sheer terror what it could not achieve through strategy or skill, a final, horrific gamble that would define not only the future of Ukraine, but the security of the entire world for decades to come.